Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 19 November 2024. It is the 191st anniversary of the birth of Wilhelm Dilthey, who was born in Wiesbaden-Biebrich on this date in 1833. Dilthey has been pervasively influential, but it's difficult to put my finger on exactly what that influence consists of. So how do we know that Dilthey has been pervasively influential? He has been widely cited. Selections from his writings are included in anthologies on the philosophy of history, and his books remain in print and have mostly been translated into English. Through his correspondence with Paul York von Württemberg, Dilthey became an influence on Heidegger, who has dominated continental thought since the middle of the 20th century. Near the end of Being and Time, from section 72 to 77, Heidegger discusses history, but I haven't attempted to produce an episode on Heidegger since he's not simpatico for me. But in his discussion of history, Heidegger references the correspondence of Dilthey and Count York, quoting York in extenso. This was recently brought to my attention by Eliyahu Rotenberg on Substack, so thanks for that. I wouldn't have known about it otherwise. Anecdotally, in regard to Dilthey's influence, I was told by an acquaintance that he was attacked during his PhD defense because of his perceived lack of interest in Dilthey. So there's that. Dilthey's influence should mean that he is widely read, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. And it isn't hard to figure out why, because Dilthey is a difficult philosopher to read. Of course, I'm reading English translations of Dilthey, and a former friend of mine, a translator, once told me that he had never read anything that was clearer in translation than it was in the original. So it's entirely possible that Dilthey has suffered in translations. But others can be much clearer about Dilthey's thought than Dilthey himself. Recently, I got a copy of Wilhelm Dilthey's Philosophy of History by William Kluback, and on the very first page of the preface, Kluback writes, quote, Dilthey set out to give structure to historical thought. He maintained that worldviews are the basic structure in which the external world is perceived. Dilthey demanded that the structure of historical thought arise from life and not be imposed upon it. History, he asserted, can accomplish more than description. History can re-experience and intuit all intellectual expressions, unquote. You'd have a hard time finding anything as clear and concise in Dilthey. And on that, Kluback himself wrote, quote, there is little organization or unity in Dilthey's writings. Even the titles of his works support this impression. In Dilthey's works themselves, one often finds that discussions are fragmentary and incomplete, that ideas are suggested but never fully developed, unquote. Dilthey's Introduction to the Human Sciences is a ploddingly slow read in my experience, but it is important for understanding Dilthey's position in relation to philosophy of history. He specifically devoted 4 chapters of the Introduction to the Human Sciences to a critique of philosophy of history. Chapter 14, neither philosophy of history nor sociology is really a science. Chapter 15, the philosophy of history and sociology cannot fulfill their tasks. Chapter 16, the methods of the philosophy of history and of sociology are wrong. And chapter 17, philosophy of history and sociology do not recognize the relationship of history as a science to the particular social sciences, unquote. Well, I was quoting the chapters of the titles of the chapters. This isn't a critique of the mere possibility of the philosophy of history, but of how philosophy of history has gotten it wrong so far. Dilthey characterized philosophy of history as follows, quote, by philosophy of history, I understand a theory which undertakes to discern the system of historical reality through a corresponding system of unified principles. This feature of unity of thought is inseparable from theory, which has its distinctive task precisely in recognizing the system of the whole. And so philosophy of history locates this unity now in a blueprint of historical process, now in a basic concept, an idea, now in a formula or a set of formulas which express the law of development. Sociology, I speak here only of the French school, escalates this claim to knowledge even further inasmuch as it aspires to introduce scientific direction of society by knowledge it has of this system, unquote. This is more sophisticated than most critiques of philosophy of history that are made in this vein. There are many philosophers who have criticized any attempt to see history whole, but Dilthey doesn't merely mirror this problematic holism. He specifically cites the theoretical comprehension of history through a unified system of principles. And since it's difficult to imagine any system, any study of anything undertaken without a system of unified principles, his critique would apply to any principled study of history. But Dilthey also acknowledges that the theoretical unity of history can take many forms: a blueprint, a basic concept, a formula or set of formulas. So he's not assuming that a unified system of principles must be monolithic. As I said earlier, Dilthey's distancing of himself from philosophy of history is more sophisticated than many of the efforts I have called non-philosophy of history, such as Descartes, Jakob Burckhardt, Simone Weil, and Karl Löwith. Dilthey, to his credit, also has concrete and constructive suggestions on how philosophy of history ought to be carried out. Here is Dilthey's take on the proper way to do philosophy of history. Quote, "The thinker who takes the historical world as his object must be firmly and directly in contact with the unmediated raw material of history and be master of all the historian's methods. He must subject himself to the same law of struggling with the raw material as the historian. The operation of adding either psychological or metaphysical principles to material that has already been bound into an artistic whole by the eye and work of a historian, this operation will always remain futile. If we speak of a philosophy of history, that can only mean historical research which has a philosophical bent and makes use of philosophical resources," unquote. This sounds like the familiar appeal to the working historian that I have mentioned in my episodes on Morton White and Siegfried Kracauer. But that isn't the direction that Dilthey pursued this. Instead, for Dilthey, being directly in contact with the raw, unmediated material of history meant familiarity with the lived experience of history. As far as I have been able to discover, Dilthey is the source and the origin of the idea of lived experience. So this is at least one definite and influential idea that we can pin on Dilthey. Every so often, a term from the kind of philosophy that is generally not read by the wider public, and which is therefore sometimes called technical or professional, finds its way into the wild, as it were, and begins to appear in non-philosophical contexts. This happened with Thomas Kuhn's use of paradigm shift, and it happened with Derrida's use of deconstruction. To a lesser extent, it's also true of phenomenology, since Husserl's popularization of the term. Dilthey's lived experience is another such technical philosophical term that has come into general currency. Today, we find the idea of lived experience and its variants invoked in all kinds of contexts, both technical and popular. For example, one variation on the theme of lived experience that I found is felt experience, which I found in Barry Mazur's 2008 paper, Mathematical Platonism and Its Opposite, in which the author refers to, quote, "the passionate felt experience that makes it so wonderful to think mathematics," unquote. I noticed that lived experience is used in the title of a non-philosophical book, Nubia in the New Kingdom, Lived Experience, Pharaonic Control, and Indigenous Traditions. A description of the book on the publisher's website says that the approach of the volume provides, quote, a more nuanced understanding of what it was like to live in colonial Kush during the later second millennium BC, unquote. In the book, we find, quote, through the integration of modern scientific methods of analysis, a more thorough understanding of the environment of Nubia and its impact on lived experience during the New Kingdom is emerging, unquote. And, quote, the study of present-day Nubia can inform model for past lived experiences, unquote. And there's also a reference to high-resolution insights into ancient lived experience. Statements like this point to the takeaway of lived experience for non-philosophers. We could say it is that what it was like to live in some particular social milieu, in some particular historical context. I can easily imagine what it was really like to live at some time becoming a slogan on a par with Leopold von Ranke's to show what actually happened, his famous line, wie es eigentlich gewesen. There's enough ambiguity in Ranke's formulation that we could construe it as meaning the same as what I am attributing here to Dilthey, but in the present context, it's more useful to contrast my reading of Dilthey with Ranke interpreted as being concerned with what actually happened, that is, what historical events took place in a given period of time which define a period. That way we have two distinct conceptions and a nice clear distinction between the two. Both what I'm attributing to Dilthey and the famous Ranke line can be taken as historiographical principles, and they could even be held to be derivable from each other. Arguably, one can't know what it was like to live in a given era without knowing what actually happened during that era. And again, arguably, one can't show what actually happened in an era without knowing what it was like to live during that era. I think that the two are distinguishable, at least in the abstract, but I only wanted to make that point of how closely related these two ideas are. Whether or not Dilthey originated the philosophical use of lived experience, he did write extensively about it earlier than most other philosophers who took up the term, especially in the third volume of the English translation of his selected works, The Formation of the Historical World in the Human Sciences. Despite Husserl's very public criticism of Dilthey in his paper, Philosophy as Rigorous Science, in which Husserl discussed Dilthey in the section Historicism and Weltanschauung philosophy, the two found common ground in their correspondence in the largely neo-Kantian idiom of German philosophy, even though both were also reacting against that tradition. Both Dilthey and Husserl were centrally concerned with the experience of time, which in Dilthey is crucially important in his conception of lived experience. Of Husserl's efforts in the elucidation of time, Dilthey wrote, quote, a true Plato, who first of all fixes in concept the things that become and flow, and then puts beside the concept of the fixed a concept of the flowing, unquote. Dilthey's own exposition of time consciousness can be found in volume 3 of the selected work in English in Drafts of a Critique of Historical Reason, section 2, Reflexive Awareness, Reality, Time, where it is integral with his exposition of lived experience. Of time and lived experience, Dilthey wrote, quote, temporality is contained in life as its first categorical determination, and the one that is fundamental for all others. Thus, the lived experience of time determines the content of our lives in all directions, unquote. I suspect that Husserl would have agreed with this, as for Husserl, time consciousness was the foundation of the constituting consciousness. Dilthey also writes, quote, that which forms a unity of presence in the flow of time because it has unitary meaning is the smallest unit definable as a lived experience, unquote. And, quote, a lived experience is a temporal sequence in which every state is a flux before it can become a distinct object, unquote. And again, quote, the course of life consists of parts of lived experiences that are inwardly connected with each other. Each lived experience relates to a self of which it is a part, unquote. Those are just a few representative quotes that I plucked out of Dilthey on lived experience. And this may give a flavor of his exposition, but I certainly don't maintain this as a fair way to come to grips with the full conception of lived experience in Dilthey. I'm not going to attempt an exhaustive exposition today. I only wanted to give you an impression of Dilthey's conception of lived experience. Both Dilthey and Husserl's discussions of time consciousness and lived experience are opaque at best. We can hope, with time and further development, that the idea of lived experience can be made more useful to us, but it is at present rather vague. For this reason, I think it would be worth the effort to take back the concept of lived experience from the vulgar. The idea is an important one, and it has a philosophical function to serve, but there's a tendency to abandon technical terms once they've found their way into popular culture. I said earlier that Dilthey's conception of time is tangled up with his conception of lived experience. A variation on the theme of lived experience is that of lived time. The French philosopher Eugène Minkowski, not to be confused with the relativity theorist Hermann Minkowski, wrote a book about lived time. Lived time presents us with a useful perspective that can resolve some of the ambiguities of lived experience. The relativistic time of Einstein and Hermann Minkowski is emphatically not the lived time of Dilthey and Eugène Minkowski. Time as it enters into physics and relativity theory is a mathematical abstraction that describes the universe, but it does not describe human experience. Someday, if we have the technology to enact in actuality the twins' thought experiment, where one stays on Earth while the other travels at relativistic velocities, returning much younger than the twin who stayed on Earth, then we will have a lived experience of relativity and relativistic time dilation, but that's not yet a part of human experience. In my episode on Husserl, I focused on his philosophy of history expressed in his final work, The Crisis of European Sciences, but Husserl also wrote a great deal on time consciousness. Husserl's manuscripts on time consciousness run to hundreds of pages and have been published as On the Phenomenology of the Consciousness of Internal Time. Interestingly, the first published collection of Husserl's manuscripts on time consciousness were edited by Heidegger. Since I've talked about the need to integrate philosophy of time with philosophy of history, there's a lot that could be said about the relevance of Husserl's work on time consciousness for philosophy of history. And this holds for Dilthey as well. Lived time and lived experience are central to Dilthey's conception of history, but the idea of lived experience has been too vague for us to use it as the tool we need to understand history. I want to try to highlight the idea of lived experience by appealing to what philosophers sometimes call the knowledge argument. This argument is often presented in the form of the Mary's Room thought experiment. So I'm going to quote from the Locus Classicus, the famous passage of the thought experiment from Frank Jackson's 1982 paper, Epiphenomenal Qualia. Quote, Mary is a brilliant scientist who, for whatever reason, is forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and use terms like red, blue, and so on. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina, and exactly how this produces the central nervous system, the contraction of the vocal cords, and the expulsion of air from the lungs that results in the uttering of the sentence, "The sky is blue." What will happen when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Will she learn anything or not? Unquote. Recurring to the earlier distinction I made between Dilthey's conception of lived experience as what it was like to live during a given era and Ronke's conception of what actually happened in a given era, here we can see a clear historical application of the knowledge argument. The historical parallel of the Mary's Room thought experiment would be to ask, if Mary had exhaustively studied life in colonial Kush during the later second millennium BC. That is, she knew it actually happened during the era. And then Mary was later enabled to actually go back and live in colonial Kush during the later second millennium BC, and then possessed lived experience of the era. Would Mary learn anything by the latter method that she did not already know from the first method? If we answer that Mary learns nothing from living in Kush that she did not already know by exhaustively studying Kush, then we can assert the equivalence of what it was like to live at a time and what actually happened in a time. If, on the other hand, we answer that Mary does indeed learn something from living in Kush that she did not learn by exhaustively studying Kush, then we ought to deny the equivalent of what it was like to live and what actually happened in a given era. While this exact thought experiment cannot be performed, there is a more mundane parallel that anyone can test. Exhaustively educate yourself about somewhere where you have never visited, and then go see the place for yourself. Do you learn anything when you visit that you didn't know from your prior exhaustive study of the place? In other words, does the lived experience of the place add to your knowledge that you had gained without lived experience of the place? There are important qualifications we need to make the historical variant of Mary's thought experiment more accurate. For example, our knowledge of colonial Kush during this later second millennium BC is highly imperfect. So even if a scholar studied every known instance of knowledge about this place and time, this knowledge would still be incomplete, so that it's inevitable that anyone, even those who have exhaustively studied all the sources on the second millennium BC Kush in this way, could learn many things as a result of getting into a time machine and being sent there. I would further argue that there is a sense in which knowledge of a historical milieu is potentially infinitistic. And I think I touched on this in my episode on Carol Quigley, who maintained that knowledge of a historical milieu is infinitistic. There are always further perspectives that might be obtained, like that of a time-traveling scholar who visits and who, in visiting, sees and notices things that no one has previously seen or noticed. Therefore, even under ideal conditions of the preservation of the historical record, no finite record can be complete. I lost my place. Sorry about that. So, starting over. Even under ideal conditions of the preservation of the historical record, no finite record can be complete, and any lived experience of a given place and time may reveal new aspects of that place and time. Therefore, lived experience will never be reducible to that which actually happened, following Ronca's formulation. This argument is clearly related to Arthur Danto's argument that narrative sentences are logically distinct from a pure chronicle, because a chronicle is exhausted in the moment. It sets down everything as it happens, but it doesn't allow us to connect things across time. A narrative can only be constructed after the fact by narrating earlier events in light of what happened later. Just as with the case of our not being able to enact the twins experiment demonstrating relativistic time dilation, we can't perform the thought experiment of sending Mary back to second millennium BC Kush, so it must remain for us a thought experiment and not an actual experiment. Still, the thought experiment can help us to sharpen our conception of lived experience and how it differs from other forms of knowledge. As I said, it's clear to us how lived time differs from abstract representation of times, and hopefully thought experiments can make it equally clear how lived experience differs from representations of experience. Now, given that history itself usually consists of an account of what happened without benefit of lived experience of what happened, history would seem to be a paradigm case of an abstract representation of past actuality. Dilthey has a clear-eyed awareness of these problems of historical knowledge. Quote, philosophy of history would have to give up its claims if it wished to use the procedure with which absolutely all real knowledge of the historical process is bound up. As it is now, it is simply wearing itself out trying to square the circle. And so its trickery is apparent enough to the logician as well. If I keep to the phenomenon of a system of reality, I can link together characteristics which present themselves to my observation in an abstraction which binds them together, one which contains the developmental law of this structure as in a kind of universal idea. No matter how shaky and confused it may be, some kind of universal idea of historical reality surfaces in everyone who has preoccupied himself with it and has then unified the system of reality in an intellectual picture. Abstractions of this kind anticipate the work of analysis in all areas. An entity of this sort was the mysteriously spherical motion with which ancient astronomy made its basis, or the living force of which biology of bygone days expressed the cause of the leading characteristics of organic life. And every formula which Hegel, Schleiermacher, or Comte have set up to express the law of history belongs to this natural thinking which always precedes analysis and is nothing other than metaphysics, unquote. From this, we can see that if Dilthey was a philosopher of history, he was a reluctant and unwilling philosopher of history. For Dilthey, Hegel, Schleiermacher, and Comte are too scientific. This is a charge that no one would make today about Hegel, but we can easily see how this attitude appears in a different form in Popper's critique of the very idea of a theoretical history and his denial of the possibility of a predictive theory of history. This would indeed be a philosophy of history like unto science, if only it were possible, but both Dilthey and Popper emphatically denied that it is possible. At least Dilthey and Popper, each in their own way, recognize that Hegelian philosophy of history is a nomothetic account, that is to say, a law-like account, which is something I mentioned being rarely recognized in my immediately previous episode on Hans Zinser. Also in my episode on Zinser, I discussed what Freud said about Weltanschauungen, or what we would call worldviews in English. Here, Dilthey's contribution is important, as he saw each era as being constituted by a distinct Weltanschauung, and he even wrote a book on the types of worldviews that there are. We can get a hint of what Dilthey was getting at in his balanced assessment of Enlightenment historiography. Quote, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which is reproached for being unhistorical, produced a new conception of history, which was conveyed in the brilliant historical masterpieces of Voltaire, Frederick the Great, Hume, Robertson, and Gibbon. In these works, the view of the human race's solidarity and progress spread its light over all peoples and ages. Now, for the first time, universal history acquired a nexus drawn from empirical observation itself. This nexus was rational in that it connected all events in terms of ground and consequence, and critically superior in its rejection of any transcendence of given reality through otherworldly ideas. It was based on a completely unbiased application of historical criticism, which did not spare even the most sacred shrines of the past, and on a method of comparison that spanned all the ages of mankind, unquote. Dilthey here recognizes the unhistorical character of the Enlightenment, but he does not fault Enlightenment historiography on this account. He doesn't condemn it, as many subsequent historians have done. For Dilthey, the Enlightenment's unhistorical treatment of history was a major milestone, and its willingness to not spare even the most sacred shrines of the past made it unbiased and universal. One could even call this a Copernican recontextualization of history. But according to Dilthey, it's not final. The great virtue of the unhistorical character of the Enlightenment historiography was its rejection of a transcendent perspective or the imposition of early otherworldly ideas, which would, if they existed, be final. In this sense, Dilthey is the anti-providential philosopher of history par excellence, but this criticism could be applied to any unitary method applied to the whole of history, whether that of providentialism or the Enlightenment or that of Hegel. So happy birthday, Wilhelm Dilthey, and thanks for listening.